This is sort of my attempt. I don't think I'm saying anything new. This is my attempt to make sense in my own mind of what I was taught by my own dissertation advisor, Dallas Willard, and mentor and friend, who maintained that Husserl was not just a realist in the logical investigations, but that he was a metaphysical realist and an epistemic realist throughout. I want to make sense of that on my own terms, remembering what I knew from Dallas's own work, and also trying to make sense of how that can make sense, especially in light of some passages and arguments that make Husserl sound like an idealist. So that's what I plan on doing, and I'd like to, before I begin into the paper proper, thank Deborah and Gina, the philosophy department at Kent State, and all of you for making this conference possible. It's really an honor to be here, so thanks for showing up. So let me just first define a couple of terms and what I mean by metaphysical and epistemic realism and anti-realism. I take metaphysical realism regarding some object to be the view that that object exists and does not depend for its existence or nature. More specifically, that its existence and nature are not grounded in its being the actual or possible object of thought, experience, or discourse carried out by finite minds. If it depends on God, I'm okay with that. Epistemic realism is really just a special case of metaphysical realism. Epistemic realism is the view that a certain object or domain of objects is metaphysically real, and that it can be perceived and known, right? So it's pretty clear that epistemic realism entails metaphysical realism, but metaphysical realism does not entail epistemic realism. I think Kant is a metaphysical realist about one class of entities and an epistemic anti-realist about phenomena, right? So that's one reading of Kant. I think Meillassoux, or was that how? Meillassoux, I'm so sorry. I think Meillassoux turns out to have a position which, as Gina made clear, is a pretty tense one, because it's pretty clear that what he calls the great outdoors is not what any human being until he wrote that book has ever called the great outdoors. And then it looks like he's a subjective Berkeleyan phenomenalist about the actual great outdoors as we know it, and for him the great outdoors is something behind an iron curtain that no consciousness, with the possible exception of maybe his, can penetrate, right? I don't mean to be rude, but I mean this is kind of in line with some of the views that I think Husserl really wants to reject. So one way of denying epistemic realism is to endorse what Dallas Willard, who is really the inspiration behind this paper, calls a Midas touch account of consciousness. And the Midas touch account of consciousness is one where once you recognize it, you start to sort of see it everywhere. An account of consciousness in which an object is changed in an essential way by virtue of coming into contact with consciousness or its language or its categories. I think Husserl thinks that sort of view is utterly incoherent, and I think the platitude of his that renders it incoherent is the one in the fifth theological investigation and elsewhere, that the intentional object of an act is its real object, and there's no point distinguishing between them. So there's a kind of switcheroo that philosophers sometimes pull, where they say that, well, when I'm conscious of a chair, I'm really conscious of something else, right? And this is especially prompted by skeptical scenarios and so forth. So was I conscious of a chair? No, it could have been an illusion. Well, then I was really conscious of, and then all of a sudden the non-veridical awareness of a chair gets transformed into the veridical awareness of something completely different. I don't think that's a good analysis of consciousness, and it's that kind of switcheroo I think that Husserl wants to avoid. So before I enter into the question of metaphysical and epistemic realism, I've been saying a lot about what Husserl thinks about these things, but one might think, first of all, that some people think that Husserl sort of got beyond the question of realism and idealism and anti-realism. And certainly he gives us very advanced conceptions of subjectivity and objectivity that aren't to be found in the tradition before him. But there's really, I don't think he ever got beyond the question of realism or anti-realism, because the question makes perfect sense. Provided the terms A and B actually designate something, the question whether A's depend on B's makes perfect sense. Do raindrops depend on rabbits? The question makes sense. Do sets depend on numbers? Do galaxies depend on consciousness? Those questions make absolutely perfect sense, it seems to me. I guess I could be persuaded otherwise. But moving beyond, well, the traditional way of thinking about realism and idealism, maybe he moved beyond that. But there's really no way out of being a realist or an anti-realist. Those partition the universe of possible views on this topic, And I don't see how that question could be meaningless. It seems to make perfect sense. And I think that a lot of people get into philosophy grappling with it, and that it sort of doesn't go away. I know it's an old traditional topic, but I don't think it's settled. I think there are good arguments on both sides, like a lot of philosophical topics, and it's worthy of our consideration still. There's a great claim about Plato or Socrates. At one point he's met at the gates, and somebody says, "Are you still there talking about saying the same old things about the same old things?" And he says, "Yeah, unlike you who are so smart, you never say the same things about the same things." So I know I'm dealing with old, unfashionable topic, but hey, fashion schmashin', right? These are eternal questions. Can phenomenology answer the question of realism? That's an additional question. So one is it meaningful? Yeah, it's meaningful. Can phenomenology help us answer it, or even answer it? And I think the answer to those questions is, yeah, I just think it can. Husserl says things all the time about the nature of being and the being of objects. This is a point, by the way, that Dan Zahavi has been emphasizing. Phenomenology is not metaphysically innocent. It has plenty to say about the being of things. And I think that this is absolutely clear. There's some quotes right there. It is an essential property under 6a. It is an essential property of the world of things that no perception, however so perfect, affords something absolute in its domain. Here's another claim. Each immanent perception guarantees necessarily the existence of its object. So he's talking about the existence of objects and their relation to consciousness. I think the mistake is to think that phenomenology is a science of pure subjectivity, and that's the end of the story. And I think that's actually just a third of the story. The other two-thirds of the story is that it's a story about objects and their relations to consciousness, and it's about these ideal entities called contents or meanings. So this threefold relationship among act, content, the content that's shareable among an indefinite number of people, and object, that essential correlation is what phenomenology is supposed to study, and he says so again and again. I just give one quote because, as you can see from this handout, I was really trying to put everything in the world in there. But to elucidate these connections between veritable being and knowing, and so in general to investigate the correlations between act, meaning, and object, is the task of transcendental phenomenology, and you find similar statements early, middle, late. It's his reigning conception of what it is. But you might still think there are two objections. I'll go over these quickly. Phenomenology brackets questions of existence and is metaphysically neutral. I don't think that, even if it does bracket questions of existence, that it's thereby barred from answering the question of realism, because the question of realism, how many of you are familiar with empirical arguments for realism or anti-realism? It's always about essences of things. I mean, if Berkeley tells you that it's the essence of an idea, that it can only exist in a mind, even an empiricist isn't going to go bother collecting samples. That's an eidetic claim about the being of ideas. You can make a priori eidetic claims about the dependence, the essential dependence of A's on B's. And if you do that, the question of realism is no longer a question of does the Andromeda galaxy exist? It's the question, do galaxies in their nature, are they the kinds of things which essentially depend on consciousness? Phenomenology should be able to say that if its task is to investigate these essential correlations. Are galaxies the kind of things that contain experiences as parts? Are they parts of experiences? Do they stand in a founding, founded, or mutual founding relationship with experiences, or with possible experiences? These are questions which make perfect sense. And then if we want to ask whether the real world, Andromeda galaxy, for instance, is ontologically ideal or real, all we need to do is perform an existential instantiation of a bunch of eidetic claims. Just like I can find out certain things about this triangle before me, even though geometry says nothing about this particular triangle. So I think the question about realism is really a set of eidetic questions. I think if you look at the history of arguments for it, it'll bear this out. These are a priori arguments. The second point on neutrality, well, and Dallas points out that Husserl's, in the reduction itself, all sorts of knowledge is presupposed about the being of things. Sections 1 through 46 of Ideas are largely dedicated to performing a series of formal and regional ontologies which prepare the way for you to actually enter the field of pure consciousness, which you do in section 47. David Bell points out that the whole process of the phenomenological reduction involves a kind of something akin to Meno's paradox. I mean, how do I know? Without antecedent knowledge, how do I know what to bracket and what to leave out? I have to know to leave out that chair, but I have to know to leave in my consciousness of the chair. what Husserl's doing in all those sections where he says, well, let's look at consciousness without performing the epoché. What? You just introduced the epoché and now you're not? He's doing the regional material ontologies so that we know how to apply the brackets. So whatever Husserl means by saying that, as he sometimes does, that phenomenology is metaphysically neutral, certainly it's not innocent of making claims about how things are and even how things essentially are. So let me then point to what I regard as the tension in Husserl's thought. Levinas actually points it out somewhere too. The tension in Husserl's thought is, first of all, realism. Right? Realism of some sort, not just metaphysical, but epistemic. I think most readers of the logical investigations, not all, come away with a sense that Husserl is giving you a broadly realist theory. Sometimes people think it's a realist theory of perception in the physical world. Husserl never says that, but it is quite evidently a realist theory about mathematical and logical objects, propositions and species, and so forth. I mean, the second investigation is one of the strongest statements you'll find in Husserl about realism about anything at all. This is an ideal class of objects, propositions that is, to which being thought and being expressed are alike contingent. So it's pretty clear that he's a realist about these things. More generally, as Levinas, maybe I'll read the Levinas quote. Sorry, let me find it really quickly. Levinas writes, in Totality and Infinity, the Husserlian thesis of the primacy of the objectifying act, which was criticized in a paper 2 days ago, leads to transcendental philosophy, to the affirmation, so surprising after the realist themes the idea of intentionality seemed to approach, that the object of consciousness, while distinct from consciousness, is as it were a mere product of consciousness, being a meaning endowed by consciousness, the result of Sinngebung. So the realist themes of intentionality, of reaching out beyond oneself and making contact with something transcendent, those don't go away after the logical investigations. They're deepened, right? If anything, the structure of intentionality and its possible objects, the reachings out of consciousness and their structure, that persists after his turn to transcendental idealism. So it's not as though we have a tension between the realism of the early Husserl versus the idealism of the later. We find the tension persisting throughout his whole corpus because the whole theme of intentionality is making contact with the in itself and the conditions for the possibility of that. Right? An idea of phenomenology that's made very clear in those lectures. That's the task of theory of knowledge, is to explain that. So this tension, on the one hand, involves a commitment to realism, and on the other hand, C, a commitment to idealism. Well, that's a clear tension, but here's the other part of the tension, which I won't spend much on. It's the principle of all principles. That is, it seems like if the world presents itself to us, this is an instantiation of the principle of all principles, if the world presents itself to us as a metaphysically real place, guess what we're entitled to do? We're entitled to take it to be metaphysically real, because the principle of all principles says that we are entitled. You know, there's ways of reading it. I think at least prima facie entitled, right? This is defeasible in the case of perception, and in most knowledge, we might have assertoric but not apodictic evidence. But if something presents itself to be a certain way, I thereby, just in virtue of that, according to the principle of all principles, now have the epistemic entitlement to take it to be that way. So everything which is given in an originary way is to be accepted precisely as it gives itself. And the world does present itself that way. So it looks like we're entitled to be realists. It looks like Husserl gives us a bunch of reasons to be an idealist if we believe his idealist interpreters. And it also that it looks like we're entitled to believe two completely contrary things. Let me just briefly go over some reasons to be a realist. One is the truth of ancestral statements, right? Which, if Gene is right, Husserl doesn't want to deny the truth of. Look, as far as we can tell, we are psychophysical beings of some sort, which are latecomers on the scene. The world is 13.7 or 8 billion years old. The Earth is 4.6. It took a couple billion of those years for any life forms of any notable complexity to get going, and we're really, really latecomers. This is knowledge. Something along these lines is knowledge. If that's not knowledge, we don't have a lot of knowledge. It looks like then that we can say at least this much. Given our best sciences, we as biological organisms are ontologically dependent on a vast nexus of causes and causal conditions in which we had no part making, shaping, or forming. If that's not true, our best science is a radical illusion. If phenomenology is going to correct our best science on that point, then it's the real science of those things, and those sciences are imposters, precisely because the science of a region is the one which is normatively qualified to disclose that region. If cosmology, if theory of evolution and so forth aren't telling us true things about our causal genesis, then those aren't real sciences, right? Husserl doesn't think that. Husserl does not think that the sciences are going to be cast in doubt by phenomenology. It's nowhere his stated task to overturn the results of the sciences. The point of bracketing, for instance, is not to give us a competing perspective on the world. The point of bracketing is to give us the only possible perspective on a region that no other science has access to, called pure consciousness. He's not trying to compete with any science whatsoever. He's trying to deepen them in certain ways. And as we'll see, he does want to say things about the being of objects that no science can say, but he's not trying to compete on their own terms with the things they have to say. Now, one might say, well, look, I mean, this only deals with us as empirical egos. What about transcendental egos? Sometimes I don't know what transcendental means, so I felt uncomfortable putting it in the title. Chad reminded me recently that David Woodrow Smith, and I've heard him say this before, so it was a nice reminder. He says, when Husserl says transcendental, what he usually means is very, very important. So, okay, that's kind of what so somebody waves a wand called transcendental and it's supposed to evaporate. Okay, so a better criticism, I think, though, is that the natural sciences just aren't even qualified to inspect the kinds of things that the question of realism raises. And this actually hits me. I mean, I have to agree with this, because earlier I said that the question of realism is an a priori question, so how could the natural sciences even address it? It doesn't lie within the sphere of their competence to raise this question. So I think a better argument for the phenomenologist would be to point to the phenomenological attitude itself. What do we find in phenomenological reflection? And what we find is, first of all, not a world of no imata. What we find is a world which undergoes no essential change by doing the phenomenological reduction. I'm not too convinced of this because I'm not sure what a noema is. I'm not sure a lot of people are too sure what it is, although people have strong opinions about what it isn't. I have strong opinions about what it isn't, and a noema is not a tree. And that's because a noema's essay is its percipi, and that's just not true of a tree, and Husserl tells us so repeatedly. And then he bothers to spell it out by telling us the noema is not the tree, right? So, and one thing you can do in phenomenological reflection is distinguish a noema from a tree. And you couldn't do that if all you were left with after the phenomenological reduction is a set of noemata. The further reason not to think that all you're aware of is noemata is if phenomenology only discussed the relationship, the correlation between an act and a noema is not a tree, then it would have to say nothing at all about the correlation between an act and a tree. If I want to find out how I'm conscious of a tree and what that structure is, the last thing I want to do is eliminate the tree and substitute it for some shimmering noemata. Then I'll find out what it's like to be conscious of a noema, but not what it's like to be conscious of a tree. So I don't think that what we find in phenomenological reduction is the elimination of the tree. Really, I don't think the purpose of bracketing is to bracket the tree, is to bracket the existence of the tree. And I should find some passages to support this view, but I don't think the world gets bracketed, although sometimes he says that. What's get bracketed is its quality of existing. And the reason I do that, he says, is to prevent any intrusion of premises from irrelevant disciplines. Now, I'll give an argument later why the existence of the object is irrelevant to the sense of an act, but Husserl didn't invent bracketing, and no one did, and no one ever needed to. Bracketing happens all the time. If I'm a physicist, I don't need to pay attention to the latest political report about the insanity coming out of our government. I can bracket that. If I hear a thought experiment given by a physicist about some people traveling on trains at 3/4 the speed of light, I don't need to ask, was anybody eating Doritos chips? So bracketing just comes with the territory. If somebody's doing geometrical proofs in colored chalk, you bracket away the color of the chalk. In fact, what natural scientists do for Husserl is they just bracket stuff. In Philosophy of a Rigorous Science, talking about what thinkers in his day called the elimination of secondary qualities, he goes, that's a horrible theory of a good practice. They don't eliminate secondary properties, they bracket secondary properties, because if I'm interested in gravitating masses, I don't need to worry about how they smell. Gravitating mass, right? So, the reason we bracket, the reason it's a big deal for Husserl, isn't because bracketing is something he invented, it's because this field of pure consciousness doesn't lie out in the open in the same delimited way that a lot of other regions do, like biological life, for instance. It's kind of plain, you don't need to do too much cumbersome reductions, as he puts it. And what we find when we look then at phenomenological reflection is we find the consciousness of a chair. We find that consciousness there even under the assumption that the chair wasn't there. So I'm not going to find, if the chair doesn't exist, that it was really of my idea of a chair, because I had a non-veridical perception of a chair, not a veridical perception of an idea of a chair. Those are two totally different things. We know this because one's a success and one's a failure, right? If I miss free throws, I don't succeed in releasing the ball from my hand. That's not the proper description of my action. Well, you failed at that. You must have really been trying to make the ball leave your hands. No. Well, that's what you're immediately trying to do. No, I was immediately aiming to make the hoop, and I failed at that thing. I didn't succeed at some completely different task. Same with perception. That's why we bracket the existence. But I do find a chair there, and the chair has all kinds of intended features, like having more to it. Not a little more to it, a lot more to it. And it doesn't just happen to have more to it, as A.D. Smith points out. It looks like it has more to it. My perception of it seems to be incomplete. And again, we don't want to pull a switcheroo. I don't have a complete perception of an incomplete object, like a story that I'm in the midst of composing. I have an incomplete perception of an object which is given as complete, as fully determinate. Give me a proposition with a well-defined predicate, and with respect to that, about that chair, and it's either true or false. Right? That is a fully determined object. I just don't know the answer. It's intersubjective. You and I can see the same chair. My experience of it can be improved upon by taking a closer look at it. And this one I think is important for phenomenological purposes. When I reflect on my experience of the chair, I don't find any activity whatsoever of making, constructing, or distorting it. Hilary Putnam is one of the Midas touch thinkers that Dallas used to like to criticize, because Hilary Putnam says things like this: objects don't exist independently of us. Objects are really, they're products of us cutting up the world, right? So I start with something called the world, and then I wind up with objects. That might be true, but if it is true, it has no phenomenological support whatsoever. Try it. If I was conscious of transforming the chair into something else, then that would be the object of my perception of the chair. If I was conscious of taking something called the world and cutting it up into a chair, then my experience would be of the world being cut up into a chair. And incidentally, it would be of that state of affairs, undistorted. So there couldn't be, I think, phenomenological evidence that consciousness distorts, creates, or makes its objects all the way down. It would have to begin in a process of unconscious. Because what am I conscious of? Well, if the distortion picture is true, I'm conscious of the products of a distorting process, not the process of distorting them. That process looks necessarily hidden, as it is, say, for Kant. For a phenomenologist who thinks Husserl's right about its qualifications to investigate the essence of the relation between mind and world, the absence of evidence looks like the evidence of an absence. If this did happen, phenomenology should be able to disclose it. Okay. Husserl, though, tells us he's not a realist. One of the places where he uses the term is in Ideas. And so one of his complaints is this, and this comes out very clearly in the idea of phenomenology. I've skipped the bit about the principle of all principles because I don't think it's doing that much work in the paper, but let's just say that on the basis of the principle of all principles, given the fact that in the natural attitude and in reflection, the world presents itself to us as metaphysically real, entitles us to believe that it is. Because we have two different avenues of intuitive awareness that should justify that. And yet, it looks like, on some views, Husserl is a anti-realist. Well, one thing he certainly is against is the capacity of us to ever study or find out about the essential relations he's interested in within the natural attitude. He thinks that the natural attitude, when it reflects, now it does just fine when it's, as he says, infatuated with the world, but once it turns to answering questions about how the world comes to be known, he thinks the natural attitude will always wind up in skepticism or relativism, or sometimes he puts them together, not correctly, but or skeptical relativism. The reason is that intentionality in all of its forms will be treated as nothing more than psychological phenomena bearing merely contingent relations to objects and to one another. Real causal contingent relations. So knowledge will show up, as he says, just human knowledge bound to the forms of human intellect. Evidence will be treated as a feeling. He criticizes again and again the idea that evidence is a feeling. George Heffernan is somebody who's written 2 articles on this, which are each magisterial, so I encourage you to look at those. Perception will count as nothing more than registering the contingent ways that objects affect us. So a good place to see this is, well, the result of this is that it's completely gratuitous on our part to think that our perception reveals or manifests the real natures of things, or that our logical thinking tracks their objective interconnections. So Husserl's most famous criticism of naturalism in this sense is his criticism of psychologism, which is not a criticism of psychologism, really, it's a criticism of empiricism, of trying to, it would be a criticism of linguisticism or biologism or any other attempt to ground logical essential laws on merely empirical facts. But if we turn to the case of perception, he has an argument there too. So an example that I'd like to use here today is color. Color is really hard to figure out what colors are. In a sense, they're, as Sartre said about consciousness, they're mysteries in broad daylight. But a standard theory of color that we get from the empiricist and the rationalist tradition, right, from the scientific revolution, is that color is a kind of color perception happens when some physical quality of a very complex sort, maybe reflecting wavelengths of 650 nanometers or whatever it turns out to be, causes characteristic sensations in appropriately conditioned observers under appropriate conditions, right? So what's in me is a sensation that belongs to my subjectivity. What's out there in the world is some complex of physical properties. Now, philosophers get in debates over which one of those should properly be called the color. Right? Is redness the property of reflecting light of 650 nanometers? Is redness a dispositional property of causing sensations like this? Or is redness the actual sensuous quality that we're aware of? The important point of all such theories is that the thing that we're sensuously aware of is nowhere to be found in the physical world. Right? But the worry about this theory is that it leaves out color. Unlike sensations, colors have profiles. Unlike sensations, colors are not, well, some colors are, but not every color is represented as being on my body or having a bodily felt location. I don't think that my sensations are on the other side of a room. Some of the colors I see appear to be on the other side of the room. My experience is radically mistaken if that point is wrong. The sensuous colors are over there, incidentally. And like I said, colors have profiles. There's not one way red looks. Looking red is a very complex constellation of experiences. If we dim the lights, things will not look to have changed color. They won't appear to be different, but they will appear differently. That is, they exhibit object constancy. Sensations don't do that. A pain feeling more intense is a pain being more intense, and that's kind of it. So unlike sensations, they're transcendencies. They're not given adequately. Unlike the physical qualities that allegedly cause these, they're seen. I don't see wavelengths of light. Have you? I don't see corpuscles, as Locke maybe thought was the cause of this. These complex configurations. I don't see dispositions. It looks like I see colors. Right? John Campbell, I think, does a very good job arguing this point about color. Colors are the kinds of things that people see. They're the kinds of things that most human beings, even 3- and 4-year-olds, have a favorite one of. Most people don't have a favorite wavelength of light until they've learned quite a bit, right? And more importantly, though, and I think this is really the kicker for Husserl, the relationship between, and I'm kind of interpolating here, but I think this is a central hardcore Husserlian doctrine. The relation between colors and color experience is not a contingent one. You can imagine a world in which things that reflect light of 650 nanometers cause greenish sensations in you. I'm reverting now to the familiar sensational story. Would you then have greenish experiences of red? Or would you have non-vertical experiences of green? That's a good question. I think Husserl's answer is pretty clear. You'd have non-vertical experiences of green. Now, if I was inverted with respect to you, so that everything that looked red to me looked green to you, and vice versa, I'd be a great green detector, right? I'd have these reliable causal correlations with green things, but I wouldn't be a green seer. Green wouldn't be manifest to me in the way that it is to you. Why do I think color is the thing sitting there? Well, a simple argument. Actually, Ned Block gives this example in a different context, but he draws the exact opposite conclusion, so I don't know how firmly I should believe this, but if you and I are inverted with respect to another, and I point to an apple and go, that's my favorite color, and you say, me too, and then I point to some grass and go, that's my least favorite color, and you do too, but we're inverted, doesn't it seem like we have the opposite tastes in colors? Not the same? I mean, if you had to look through the world through my eyes, all of a sudden all these things would be your worst favorite. You'd look at the apple and say, oh, that's my least favorite color. you're having reddish sensations in the presence of things that give me greenish sensations on this view. Do we have different favorite sensations? Seems to me we have different favorite colors. And one reason I think that is color is what I see. It's the object of vision, and my favorite thing is the thing that's an object of vision, not a quale that's attached to my act of seeing. The more important point is for Husserl, he follows Berkeley in thinking that if you get the colors and remove them from the world and put them in the mind, the whole perceivable phenomenal world is going to have to go in there with it for exactly the same reasons. My perception of shapes is just going to be my contingent psychological reaction to something out there in the world. And so now I have to think about my mind as a place where, as Nietzsche puts it, something's ringing the doorbells of consciousness. And I just have to guess what might be on the other side of it. And if somebody rings my doorbell while I'm upstairs, I have no idea who's at the door until I open the door. The difference is there's no possibility of me opening the door. I can sort of figure it out mathematically, but what I'll be left with is a worldview according to which everything possibly given in intuition is subjective, and everything outside the thing itself, as he always puts in quotes, is beyond all possible intuition and knowledge, and he thinks this view is absolutely absurd. Now, the color case might not have convinced you, but try to fit this world in your head, right? With undergraduates, sometimes I like to go, well, point to your head. Now point to the room, which is bigger. It's a silly argument. But what it means is that the semantic value of the term head couldn't possibly be what they just pointed to with the demonstrative. They must mean their head, somehow, is more encompassing that, well, now things get hard, right? And the truism that this is all in your head all of a sudden becomes something that looks deeply, deeply weird, as it should, because it's probably false that this is in anyone's head. It's in our head as an intentional object, but not as a part or a shtick or a piece or a moment. But the more important point is, the world that's given to us phenomenally, again, gets carved up like color into two completely different imposters sitting on opposing sides of a Cartesian divide. An adequately given sensation or an unperceivable spatial something. Which one is the table? Clearly neither. It's a transcendency. It's not given adequately. It's nothing like a mental event. And it's nothing like an unperceivable something for the simple reason that it's perceived. It's given in the flesh. So this philosophy, he thinks, the natural attitude, is always going to end up not being able to account for the essential connection between experiences with their characters on the one hand and the corresponding objects on the other. A nice way to put this might be simply this. The word cat could have referred to anything at all. The concept cat could not have been of something else. The concept of a cat could not have been of Niagara Falls. Furthermore, the concept of a cat is tied in characteristic ways to the ways cats show up in experience, to what Husserl calls their fulfilling sense. The way cats appear, therefore, couldn't have been just any way. This couldn't have been an appearance of a cat. Well, maybe. I'm not a very creative person. Somebody's going to point to some great artwork where, it's a cat when you move around it or something like that. But the Empire State Building is not going to be the appearance of a world war. That's not good. They couldn't profile itself in that way. On the contingency view, it looks like anything could just show up anyway. If intentionality is detection, feature detection, then there's really no connection whatsoever between the interior features of an act and the features of the object that it gets. How do I become a red detector? Blindfold me and yell red every time there's a red thing nearby. Give me an app and turn my camera on and have it vibrate at a frequency every time a red thing is on. That's a way to detect red. It's not a way to have red manifest in experience in the way that is in phenomenal consciousness. So, this is why Husserl writes, it's absurd to connect the things of the senses and physical things together through causality. In doing so in the usual manner of realism, one confuses the sensory appearances, the appearing objects as such, that is this room right here, by virtue of their, quote, mere subjectivity, Husserl doesn't think they're merely subjective, with the absolute experiences of appearing that constitute them, i.e. with the actual sensations and perceptual experiences, which are not, given in space at all. So what are these appearing objects? They are the physical things that Husserl is talking about. Here's what he writes later on. In the method of physical science, the perceived thing itself, always and in principle, is exactly the thing that the physicist investigates and scientifically determines. So the physical scientist is not, on Husserl's view, reaching behind appearances to find a thing in itself behind them. She's just abstracting various of the properties of the thing and ignoring them for the purposes of her investigation. right? And this comes out pretty clearly, right, in the crisis writings. And this is why he writes, it's a fundamental mistake to suppose that perception does not get at the thing itself, or to suppose that the thing itself is not given to us in itself and in its being in itself. That's a strong statement. Doesn't sound like much of an idealist there. You're mistaken if you don't think perception does this. It gets at the thing, it gets at the thing itself, and it gets at it as it is in itself. So when I characterize a table as rectangular, I'm characterizing the table, not something else. As it is rather than it isn't, and as it really is. It, the table, the thing itself, not some other thing, is really rectangular. It's not schmectangular. It's not something God I know not what which causes rectangular sensations in me. Perception lays hold of the thing itself as it is in itself. But yet Husserl just told us that he rejects realism. Well, I don't think he rejects realism. In fact, it's pretty clear that by realism here, what he means is a certain kind of naturalism according to which the only connections between things are real connections. And he thinks real connections are contingent connections. So the realism he has in mind here is something which is blind to the reality of the ideal. And the ideal here means ideal with a big capital I, a big Platonic ideal. It's blind to essential connections. And in the introduction to the second logical investigation, Husserl mentions idealism in this connection. Idealism is not, he says, this weird metaphysical doctrine. It's just the doctrine that recognizes the ideal, and you know what the second investigation is about. It's about defending the reality of ideal species. That recognizes the existence of the ideal as a condition for the possibility of the objectivity of knowledge. And his problem with psychologism was it couldn't do that. And his problem with empiricism is that it doesn't do that. It turns connections of essence into connections of causal covariation. My experience just turned out to be signs of something I know not what. So far, Husserl thinks that it's completely false to think that the only connections among acts and objects is an existential one, or right, a contingent one. And this gives us another reason to bracket. So that I don't think the causal relation that holds between me and the table is the intentional relation or is the converse of the intentional relation. That way I can consult the experience's own sense and see what it's aiming at. Because otherwise I might think to myself, wow, if I'd been in the presence of a car and it caused reliably sensations like this in me, my experience would have been of a car. Or I would have had car-ish experiences of a table. So then I would think that I could appeared too car-ly and still have an intentional relation with the table. And I think Husserl would find that to be completely incoherent. I wouldn't have then a non-standard veridical perception of a table, but a non-veridical perception of a car. And same with colors. Make me a color invert, that's conceivable. What's not conceivable is to turn a normal perception of green into a non-standard veridical perception of red. Not only then do experiences on Husserl's view essentially relate to their objects in virtue of their inner character, in virtue of their sense and their fulfilling sense whenever that's there, I think he also thinks the essence of each object determines the family of experiences that could possibly be of it. David Woodruff Smith and Sokolowski draw this out. In fact, Smith draws on Sokolowski in this sense. And for Robert Sokolowski and David Woodruff Smith, the sense in which Husserl's view is transcendental idealism is that consciousness is, as Dallas Willard puts it, completely unrestricted to the kind of thing it takes as a term. Anything whatsoever, including what doesn't exist, could be an object of consciousness, including impossibilities, as Chad pointed out. And it belongs to every one of them, not just the possible ones, but even the impossible ones, that in some sense, they have a mode of appearing before consciousness. And this is the interesting place where phenomenology has something to say about the world that this natural sciences can't, because it belongs to the essence of an object that it shows up to consciousness in a series of characteristic ways. So a textbook on chemistry will tell you a lot of things about salt and how it can dissolve in water. The book will say nothing about salt and its relation to knowledge. But the book itself stands as a testimony to salt's capacity to relate itself to knowledge and consciousness. So natural science makes use of the appearance of things, this power of theirs to manifest to consciousness, without ever making that thematic. And what phenomenology does, and the reason Dan Zahavi is absolutely right, that it's not confined in subjectivity, is because it discloses a dimension of the being of objects that sciences use without ever making thematic. And that's why phenomenology is a big deal. But so far, we don't have an argument against realism as I've defined it. We have an argument against realism as Husserl defines it, but that clearly means something else than what I defined it. What then about Husserl's transcendental insight? And how am I doing on time? Am I?
You've got a little under 10 minutes.
Okay, well, this could be hard. One of the best pieces of evidence, one of the best arguments, at least, that I'm aware of in the secondary literature for Husserl being a metaphysical idealist, because I haven't done really much to support the view that he's a metaphysical realist at this point, just warded off, well, he's not an anti-realist just because he rejects something he calls realism, because that's not really realism as I understand it and as most philosophers understand it. But Husserl does issue some claims in a number of places that sound strongly idealistic. It's what A.D. Smith, in his commentary on the Cartesian Meditations, called Husserl's, quote, transcendental insight. And the transcendental insight, I chose one example there on the handout from Formal and Transcendental Logic. Nothing exists for me otherwise than by virtue of actual and potential performance of my own consciousness. Here's another one from Ideas 1. Whatever I encounter as an existing object is something that has received its whole being sense for me from my affective intentionality. I'll give you one more from the Cartesian Meditations. The objective world, the world that exists for me, that has always and always will exist for me, the only world that can ever exist for me, this world with all its objects derives its whole sense and its existential status, which it has for me from me myself, from me as the transcendental ego. If that's not idealism, what is, you might say, right? The strong reading of this, A.D. Smith says, actually, this statement, and there are many others. There's even one from the Logical Investigations. They permit of two different readings, he thinks, a strong reading and a weak reading. And here's where A.D. Smith loses his characteristic carefulness, it seems to me, in translating these. But I think we can get the gist of what he means. The strong reading is that everything other than consciousness itself is but a construction thrown up by consciousness, and its existence is dependent upon consciousness. So that's one possible reading of statements A and B. The weak reading is that something can exist for me only if I'm around. And there seems to be a really obvious problem with that version. The problem is that this appears to be the merest platitude and not the world historical revelation that Husserl takes it to be. All right. Against the strong reading. I don't think the strong reading is even a reading. Like, I've looked at the sentences in various places, and it's hard for me to see where Husserl in either A or B says that the world is a construction thrown up by my consciousness. But notice that every formulation I read and every one that I found keeps talking about the world and the existence and the sense it has for me. If this would be an argument that proves too much, kind of like Berkeley's master argument, according to some people, proves too much, right? It doesn't just prove that you can't conceive of a world without conceiving it, caught you. So you can't think of a world that's unthought of. Berkeley's argument proves that you can't think of a world which isn't thought of by you, it seems to me. In which case, he has to think that everything that exists depends on you, because try to think of something that you're not thinking of. It's not a great argument, but it's... What Husserl's saying here is that whatever things have for me, they have because of my intentionality. But then all these statements would have to be read as claiming that the world is but a construction thrown up by my consciousness. I'll just stop there and say that is just massively implausible. I don't know. I think Schopenhauer's right when he called solipsism in need of a cure, not a refutation. I feel like I'm just kicking a rock or begging a question, but how about this? I've met somebody before who wasn't me. And so like G.E. Moore, I find that to be more evident than any conjunction of premises any philosopher I've ever read anywhere on any topic ever has ever thrown my direction. So if your theory entails the falsity of I've met somebody at some point who wasn't me, I think I'm going to have to leave your theory behind. Anyway, Husserl clearly doesn't think the world is a construction thrown up by his consciousness, Husserl's. He thinks the world is an objective place, or at least intersubjective. Right? That would be a horrible interpretation of Husserl. And it would, I think, just be clearly false. Another reason is that Husserl denies the idealistic inference in specific and crucial cases. I mean, this is just an instantiation of the transcendental insight. Even God is for me what he is in consequence of my own productivity of consciousness, really my achievement of consciousness, Leistung. And he goes on, here too, as in the case of the other ego, thank you, productivity of consciousness will hardly signify that I invent or make this highest transcendency. So he's not claiming credit for the being of God or the other. And then he continues, the like is true of the world and all worldly causation. So God, the other, the world, and the worldly causation, all is what it is for Husserl in virtue of his Bewusstseinleistungen, the achievements that he can carry out in his consciousness. And then he says, this doesn't mean I make them. As Dallas used to say, you don't make the object, you make the consciousness of the object. You make yourself able to relate to the object, right? If I have the concept of salt, I now have a power I didn't have before, the power to think about salt. That's not making salt, it's making a power that I now possess, the power to think about salt. So it seems like this is a crucial case. I mean, Husserl just clearly denies the reading that Smith wants to give him in these crucial cases, which are just straightforwardly cases of the transcendental insight. Now, what about the weak reading that, what is it again? Something can exist for me only if I'm around? Yeah, that's right. And not only is that right, I think that's more or less what Husserl means. And you want to say, well, why would Husserl say the merest platitude? The reason he'd say the merest platitude is because that platitude turns out to be something that is contradicted by realistic naturalism and by almost every form of Kantianism. That's why. It's because platitudes become the merest platitudes when some wizard like Edmund Husserl points them out, but they're not platitudes if they're not made thematic. We take it for granted, he thinks. It's always been taken for granted. The a priori correlation between act and object has always been taken for granted. Everyone's always known it, but it never evoked wonder, he said, until my own logical investigations. What does it mean they took it for granted? That they all thought it? No, they just all acted as though it was true. When you think about something, you take it for granted that you're thinking of that thing and not some totally different thing, and that you're thinking of it as it is rather than as it isn't. Dallas Willard used to have a remark about Richard Rorty. When Rorty tells you there's no way the world really is, he's kind of just told you how things really are. Because it's a constant presumption of thought to hit its object rather than a different one and characterize it as it is rather than some other thing. And it looks like all kinds of versions of anti-realism and Midas touch epistemology end up denying that basic truism. So yeah, it's a platitude when Husserl mentions it. It's a platitude that in order for me to be conscious of X, there has to be something about me which enables me to be conscious of X, and you can't do it for me. My mind has to be the one configured in a definite way. It would be as if a key said, you know, every time I unopen a lock, that's because I'm shaped in this very interesting way that enabled me to turn the pins and tumblers of that lock. Well, that's a platitude, but if he lived in a community of philosophizing keys, he would invariably find people who deny this. That, well, you change the lock every time. No, well, no. So I think it's a platitude, and I think it's an important one, and it's just the kind of thing which is obvious once you get it, like the punchline of a joke, but try to come up with a joke. It's not easy. And it's also just the kind of thing which should sit at the very gateway of a science which is supposed to consist exclusively of things which are evident. Husserl hates profundity. Profundity is a bad word. In philosophy of a rigorous science, no genuine science knows profundity. So my friend Dave Casimir says, as a basic hermeneutic principle in interpreting Husserl, doesn't always work, if you are faced with a deep, profound, or a trivial reading of something, go trivial, because Husserl's trying to say things that are obvious. And it would really be a big deal if at the gateway to a science which consists of obviousnesses, to have this world-shaking, totally non-obvious statement. Whatever metaphysical idealism is, it's not a platitude, right? You should have platitudes at the gateway of a science like phenomenology. So, where does this leave us? Well, Husserl clearly thinks that naturalism's false, so naturalistic realism's out. And he clearly thinks that, I think, metaphysical realism and epistemic realism couldn't, or anti-realism couldn't both be true. And this is why he doesn't believe in things in themselves. So I think when Husserl argues against things in themselves, he's not arguing against the existence of things which could exist independently of being conceived or known. He's arguing against the possibility of things which could not possibly have a mode of givenness to consciousness whatsoever. And more importantly, as Karl Amerix points out, he's arguing against the possible rationality of believing them. I think it's something like Moore's paradox, right? Moore's paradox is, I believe it's raining, but it's not. Or it's raining, but I don't believe so. That's not a logical contradiction, but that's a deeply paradoxical remark. right? Here's a deeply paradoxical remark. There are things in themselves, but nobody could ever possibly have evidence that there are. Who could say that rationally? When I say there are things in themselves, I'm putting that forward according to the norms of discourse as something for which I have evidence. And then in the second part of the statement, I'm retracting the very possibility of me obeying that conversational norm. So by pragmatic implicature or something like that, it turns out to be a really ill-formed sort of statement. Yeah, I believe in dragons, but nobody could possibly ever have any evidence that there are any. That's absurd. Then why did I say there are any? I believe in peas, but I have no evidence for them, and I couldn't. What kind of belief is that? It's unmoored from the norms of believing. So I think that's what Husserl means in rejecting. It's logically conceivable that there could be things in themselves that are unknowable, but it could never be a rational achievement to believe in those things. So finally, just to wrap up, Husserl, I think, thinks there's an essential connection between consciousness, its contents, concepts, fulfilling senses, intuition, horizons, and objects of various types, such that every object is the kind of thing which could only be present to a consciousness which is configured in a very definite way. And the task of phenomenology is to tell you how you have to be shaped and configured as a consciousness in order to lay hold of objects of various types. Right? So what Don did this morning is looking into spatiality in the body. How must intentionality, including the body, be configured for you to be aware of things in space? Right? It's a story of the necessary conditions. The world is this lock that needs to be opened. What shape must the key be to open up that world? But it's not a theory according to which the key is making the lock or the lock is making the key. H.A. Pritchard pointed out something interesting in his book on Kant in the early 1900s. He said that the Copernican revolution is a false dichotomy. Either objects must conform to knowledge or knowledge must conform to the objects. They have to conform to one another. What if a key wrote the critique of opening locks? Either the lock has to conform to the key or the key must conform to the lock. Well, they got to conform to one another. And conformity there is not a matter of making, it's a matter of having distinctive essences which come into relationship with one another. And the important point for Husserl is that the connection between acts and objects and their contents is not one of existence. It's an essential connection. It's not that this chair depends upon being the object of consciousness. It couldn't, because each of its parts is also an object, and there's no possible way that all of its parts could be co-present to consciousness, especially not to one consciousness. So there are plenty of objects we know to exist which aren't the objects of any consciousness right now, at least not of any intuitive consciousness. The connection, rather, it's an essential one. It's a connection of essence. A chair, being the kind of thing it is the kind of thing which can possibly show up in various acts of perception and knowledge. It's like this connection. A triangle, being the kind of thing it is the kind of thing that could have a circle inscribed in it. That belongs to the essence of a triangle. It belongs to the essence of a circle, that it could be the kind of thing which could also be inscribed in a triangle. That doesn't mean every triangle has a circle inscribed in it. It means that this lies within its power. Salt is the kind of thing which can dissolve in water. That's actually not an essential property of it, maybe. I don't know how you feel about that. I kind of think it is. But that would be a true property of water as a disposition, even in a world with of salt, even in a world with no water. It could still be a true property of objects, that they're essentially the kinds of things which could be known, even in worlds not which they're not known, but even in worlds which contain no consciousness whatsoever, which could be part of an answer to. But anyway, I'll stop right there. And so there's doing the best I can do to claim that Husserl is a realist of a metaphysical sort, or at least he doesn't rule out metaphysical realism. But yeah, interested in your questions. Thanks.
Okay, we have about 10 minutes for questions.
I think that was really great.
Oh, well, thanks.
Yeah.
But
the first question that comes to mind is, and I think you defined that really well, that it's a matter of essences, the essence of an object and the essence of consciousness. And that's how consciousness and being are inherently, essentially related to each other.
Yeah, and that's Dallas's line in Logic and the Objectivity.
And then speaking of
knowledge.
Dallas Willard, does this have theological implications?
I don't know. Probably. I'm not sure.
What did Willard say?
Well, he didn't talk about it. He kept,
Really?
yeah. So it was clear that it was clear in Dallas's mind, I think, that there was a deep connection, an affinity between phenomenological thinking and his religious thought. And I think that one thing that he thought was that he thought that in religious thought we could lay hold of God inadequately in religious experience as God is. We're not dealing with a simulacrum. Now, it's an inadequate apprehension. I think he thought that. I think he thought that there could be genuine encounters between persons, us and God. And so vindicating the possibility of the objectivity of knowledge, I think for him was an enormously important thing just for religious epistemology. But I didn't really talk with him about the connection between his Christian thought and phenomenology.
Couldn't this be an argument for the existence of God? Why is it that being as such essentially is that which is necessarily able to appear to consciousness?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think maybe it could, but I would feel totally unqualified to give it. And but there's a way in which, yeah, that's a super great question. I don't want to give a glib response to that one. I think maybe it could. I mean, you might puzzle at this point, right, about this weird pre-established harmony, right, between consciousness and being, such that they look like they're just kind of made for one another. And there's one interpretation on which it wouldn't be an argument for that at all, simply because what a being is just is the kind of thing that could show up for consciousness. And then use Husserl's arguments that any other kind of being that you would posit just makes no sense for some deep metaphysical reasons having nothing to do with God.
Couldn't even be a being.
Couldn't even be a being, right? So, yeah, that's a great question. I wish I had more to say about it.
I want to believe you.
This is where I am, yeah. Throw the hard passages at me.
But I noticed that you studiously kind of avoided any probe into two issues, which may necessary to cover in order to carry this. One is the status of sensations.
Yeah.
And the other has to do then with a word we haven't mentioned very much in this conference, fortunately, but nevertheless has to come into play here, and that's the status of the noema.
Yeah. Good.
In other words, what are you going to do with content? What are you going to do with meaning in this context? And it isn't going to be enough. It isn't going to be enough to take a realist approach, because then you're going to end up with ideal structure confronting something which is not an ideal structure, namely sensations. And so you're going to end up with a bind here. So I guess what I'm asking for is some further clarification of the scheme of constitution such that you can still be a realist. Yeah,
great. So that's a great question. First of all, when it comes to Husserl on sensation, I don't like Husserl, what he has to say about sensations until he starts to sort of intentionalize them, maybe in passive and active synthesis and later. Sensations as color-like spread out somethings existing in my sphere of consciousness. I can't find these things, so I'm kind of with Merleau-Ponty and almost everyone else in rejecting that view. But there's still this question, right? There are real, and there are such things as bodily sensations. The first worry was that we have these ideal meanings coming into contact or confronting in the flow of experience itself, right? Hyletic data, a stratum of hyletic data. I think the answer there is that both of them can be partitioned into idealities and their real instantiations. So the matter of an act, Husserl says in the fifth investigation, is a moment of an act. And the intentional essence it's a misnomer. The essence is not an essence. The real essence in the real sense is the meaning, which is an ideational abstraction of an act's matter and quality. So the task, right, in the introduction of volume 2 of the investigations, one of the tasks there is to investigate how the ideality of the universal comes into the flux of consciousness. And the way it comes in on the logical investigation stories, it becomes instantiated. The meaning becomes temporalized and here and now, even though it's an ideal thing, by being instantiated in the matter and quality of my act. The sensational properties are also instantiations of universals. I mean, there is an essence to a sensation of pain or a sensation of pinching on one's right hand. It's a repeatable something which has a nature of its own. So I take it to be a general principle of Husserl's that everything particular instantiates essences. And so what we have then is relations of an essence among, for instance, meanings and the kind of sensuous filling that could fulfill them. And those are relations of essence. And he says so in the sixth investigation. not too clearly, but and then in their instantiations, my act right now of seeing this blue phone, those things enter into the flux of real space and time and come into the same agreement which is prescribed by their essence according to the eidetic laws. Your second point had to do with, I don't know if that helps at all, but
you're going to have to make your essence, you're going to have to make your meanings prescriptive then.
Maybe so. Why would they have to be prescriptive?
Well, in other words, you have to be able to affect some type of synthesis or some kind of control over what's going to count as eidetic data. It has to be more than just a kind of abstract features of some kind of a complex here.
Huh.
You've got to get that. You've got to get the basalem.
Yeah.
Animating. In other words, that I'm just staying with this terminology now.
Sure.
So I think that's not going to be strong enough to do justice to what he was arguing.
Yeah, well, the picture I just gave is not strong enough to say how the interpretation or the Auffassung of it takes place. And he's notoriously vague. I mean, right, Kevin Mulligan points out that as far as Husserl tells us, Auffassung is just that thing, whatever it is, which turns sensations from dead matter into presentations of color. So it's sort of like the Far Side cartoon where there's a scientist, or maybe it's a New Yorker cartoon with equations on the table and it says, and then a miracle occurs. Scully says, I think, could you fill in that step?
Yeah, but you can't do that because that what it means is anything that's going to count against your an anti-realist reading of Husserl that gets shoved off.
Yeah, we can't do that. My own view, for what it's worth philosophically, is that Husserl's captivated by an empiricism about sensations. I agree with PMS Hacker that if you want a sensation in your eye, throw some dust in it. Color is not a sensation, right? Color's out there in the world, and the way color shows up is through various Abschattung, and those aren't sensations either. They can be photographed, as Hermann Philipps points out. What we find then are intentional properties lying at the level of intuition, intentional properties lying at the level of meaning, which could survive the obliteration of intuition, and somehow they come into an appropriate synthesis in appropriate circumstances, partly passively and partly through the active agency of an agent. And we can imagine them coming apart and coming together in various ways. But their capacity to come together in that way is also prescribed by their essential nature. So if the proposition is this phone is blue, that prescribes a very definite, fulfilling sense, infinite but bounded, fulfilling sense of what could count as verifying or confirming that proposition. How that actually plays out in the life of a subject in time is going to be a big deal. Because I could have a blue phone in my visual field the whole time and not once have the thought fulfilled. Because I just don't care. I just don't think the thought that it's blue. So I can perceive it the whole time and not once fulfill the thought that it's blue. So some activity on my part helps to bring about that relevant synthesis. Yeah.
It is 2:40, so I think we're going to have to end there. Thank you again.